Hello, I'm Kevin Tharp, and this is going to be a discussion or a reflection about the first year that I spent involved with the Universal Design for Learning project here at the University of Wisconsin-Stout. Let me start with a little bit of background about the way that I see universal design. And I think that the most important element to bring out right away is that it is a systematic design. One of the criticisms or questions that comes up when you're talking about universal design is, what is the difference between universal design and good teaching? And you can accidentally fall into good teaching, but you don't accidentally fall into universal design. Universal design is a systematic approach at the design level, not the implementation or the delivery level, but at the design level, where you're thinking about what are possible barriers to access that different students may have that are currently involved in my course materials, and what can I do to minimize those without creating barriers for others. What you see in this slide is it's a curb cut. It is a standard feature of street design, of how they design sidewalks so that they will be accessible to the most number of people. And it is designed in a systematic way. It's thought about beforehand, and it's built in now to most of the curbs that you see that are being built. This is in comparison to accommodation. As teachers, if you teach long enough, you're going to get requests for accommodations from various students who have different types of challenges to their learning. And what we then have to do is go in and retroactively find a way of creating access to those materials. So by using a systematic design, we design those materials to try and minimize accommodation so that we can take those things out, so that by the very nature of how our content is designed, it's accessible to more people with different kinds of challenges, so that we don't have to do this one-off accommodation, which is generally not as acceptable of content, takes a lot of time, a lot of resources, and doesn't generally, sometimes it does, but generally speaking, it doesn't get the full access that they would have if it had been designed into that curriculum originally. And what you'll find is that when you design those interventions to overcome a specific identified barrier, like we've been talking about the curve cuts, and those curve cuts were put in place to help to overcome the barrier of people who had mobility issues getting up and down the curves, for instance, with a wheelchair. So the curb cut was designed to overcome that identified barrier, but in the process what has happened is that many other people, that design helps other people to overcome barriers that may not have been identified. So by addressing these issues, not only do you overcome the barriers that you knew about, but if it's done well, then you're also overcoming other barriers and giving people choices and alternatives about how to access your course content, and that ends up being beneficial to a wider number of people. Now, industry has clearly defined its universal design standards. Universal design came out of a couple areas. One is architecture, and the other is web design. So these are two areas where they have clear standards of how you provide access, or universal design standards. And it's very granular in these areas about how you go about doing this, as is seen in this clearing. But what we found is that education is not, it does not have a clear set of standards for universal design, and one size does not fit all. And that's an important point to bring into this conversation, is that the way that you approach your classes is going to be unique. It's going to be different than everybody else has, because you're going to have different content. You're going to have different challenges. There's going to be some base issues that are easy to address, and or not, maybe not easy, but they're easy to identify. And those are the ones that currently we address accommodations for right now. But education does not have a one-size-fits-all, because we're dealing with individuals and learning styles, which is a cognitive issue rather than a physical issue. So it's a lot harder to go about doing that. And the most important piece of advice that I can take from what I've learned is that you're not going to go from where you're at right now to a completely universally designed course or set of courses in one semester or 1 year. What you have to do is start with where you are at today and identify some kind of an issue and go forward with that. And if we do it in that way, we're going to be continually improving the content that we're offering to our students. And that is the goal of universal design, is to make it easier for our students to access the content with or without having identified barriers to access. The three primary principles that you're going to be interacting with are to provide multiple means of representation, provide multiple means of action and expression, and provide multiple means of engagement. And you're going to be hearing a lot about that as you go into UDL. And that's really going to be the thing that is going to be the most challenging probably for you, is to how do you get your head around these principles and then start applying those principles to your classes. So let me talk about how I did it. And this next image is, for me, a really good example. Ultimately, what you're trying to do is provide alternatives, but as you provide those alternatives, you want to make sure that the design is such that you allow the various students to progress together through your content. The reason that I like this image is it's a staircase, but it's also a ramp. But in this case, if you were, say, using a wheelchair or a walker, you could go through this staircase with people who didn't have those challenges. So I, as an individual, can choose to go through the same path, and I can choose that path either by going up the ramp or by going up the stairs, so that there's different alternatives that are built in together, and they're built in together because they are a systematic design rather than an accommodation. So that's what's cool about this, and this slide really sums up what I'm talking about. You've got the handrails, you've got the steps, you've got the ramp, and they all go through in the same place, in the same way, without having to be changed or sending somebody off on a different path that will allow them to get to the end. So this image is probably my favorite about what does all of this mean. So my reflection is on the Universal Design for Learning at UW-Stout that I was involved with from August 2011 to May 2012. There were 10 of us faculty members involved, and our design was to create universal design or implement universal design into some class for the spring of 2012. And of course, each instructor took a different approach because they were dealing with different problems. Now, the nice thing about the approach that we've got to universal design is that it allows us to take a participative action research approach. And this is the formal structure that I used in the research and the interaction that I did. And participative action research is a research background that involves both a problem-solving interest and a research interest. So in our classrooms, we're always trying to find ways of teaching better, of designing better content, etc. What this does is it formalizes that process, which is cyclical, and the participative action research cycle is cyclical too, in that you've got a problem-solving interest where, as a teacher, you are trying to affect something in the classroom, the ability for students to learn, whatever that specific may be. But it also brings in a research interest that's looking at the same thing. How can I do formal research into this change that I'm trying to do, so that the problem-solving interest informs the research interest, and the research interest then informs the problem-solving interest, so that it becomes a cycle where you make a plan, you implement it, you evaluate it, you reflect upon it, and then you revise your plan and you do it again in such a way that your research is feeding into what you're doing in the classroom, and what you're doing in the classroom feeds into your research. So it becomes a nice way of blending what you're trying to do with your students along with what you're trying to do with your research. And so it becomes a real nice package for doing research related to the teaching and how you're trying to improve your teaching. So in my case, I was looking at a web design and distribution course. It was implemented in an online and a hybrid section. Hybrid meaning that it met face-to-face and they were given content electronically via the web. The problem that I identified is that I used instructional videos for hands-on case study labs. And let me give you a quick display of what that means. Here is a sample of content that I would have had in the class in semesters prior to doing this.
So now we've figured out if we have a website, and now what we need to do next is to figure out how to connect to it and start using that site, using that as a place where we can publish. So the first thing that we need to do is come into Dreamweaver, and you need to go to Site and then New.
Okay, so that is the way that I would create videos, very similar to what you're viewing right now. And I would make my instruction available through these videos that the information was only accessible through the videos. And I had the opportunity in a face-to-face class to interact with some of those students, and I heard some of the students say, "Oh, I love the videos," and I heard other students saying, "Oh, I can't learn from the videos. I'm having real problems with that." So that was the problem that I wanted to change in my course. So that's where I designed my intervention. And so I came up with a plan. And this is the plan that I came up with to design my universal design for learning for last year. And it started off with the student, and what I wanted to look at is their perception of their learning styles. So I had them do a survey of their learning styles. And then I've got a series of learning modules that are each week they have one of these learning modules, and that module has a set of objectives. And the way that it is approached is we've got the theory aspect, which starts with the textbook, and we've got a practice element that goes into labs. And then from the textbook, we've got applied theory in the form of a case study. And the video that I showed you just a minute ago was the way that I used to present these case studies. And the book had some problems, so I wanted to redo the way that that information was done. So I decided to redo these case studies, and what I did, and here's my UD intervention, is that I wanted to introduce multiple means of representation, so that instead of only using a video, which might introduce barriers for some students, as I had heard in the class, I wanted to give them multiple ways where they could either use a video, a hybrid, which is a combination of text and multimedia, or just text documents that would give them directions to allow them to accomplish the goals of the case study. And so for a couple of these learning modules, I created videos, hybrid documents, and text, and I made that information available to them. Now, I'm able to tell from D2L which of these things they access. So I was able to see how they used it, and I was also able to look at the web artifact and to see whether or not they had accomplished finishing that case study. And I was going to look at this as another one of my data points. So I had 3 data points: the learning style survey that they did, which of the materials they had used, and whether or not they had completed the web artifact that they were supposed to create doing the case study. And what I figured out through the process is that this really didn't become a good piece of data. It only was a question of, did they complete it or not? It didn't tell me if they had actually learned the objectives. So that will be actually, when we talk about the cyclical nature of this is going to be one of the things that I change in cycle 2, is I'm going to look at this web artifact, but I'm also going to introduce questions into these quizzes so that I can see whether or not they have learned the information here. So that will give me better information. So I implemented this, and one of the things that I immediately wanted to know is whether or not, what their perceptions of the way that they were using this content was. So from the very beginning, I implemented a revision to this, in that I had them do an evaluation survey after they had gone through the case study. And I had them do a survey that looked at whether or not what of the resources they had used, whether or not they had felt that they were valuable to help them in the way that they learned. In other words, did it address their learning styles or their preferences for learning? And this actually became a really valuable piece of information for me to look at this from a perspective of, has my universal design intervention actually accomplished what I was trying to do, which was to overcome these barriers that existed because I was only presenting information in a certain way. And so from that survey of the students after they had committed the case studies, this is the kind of information that I got from them. And so I'm not going to read these all to you, but let me point out some things. And the green highlighted parts show that the universal design was actually working. And the first student said, if the task was more complicated, I would have also used the video instructions. So this student chose one set, but if something had been more complicated, he would have used another set. So that gave him a different way of addressing his own learning styles based upon the context of the material that he was learning and his understanding of that material. So to me, that was really valuable. Another student said, sometimes I have a hard time paying attention to the videos because of the pace. So it's not that there is a problem with the video instruction and such, but that the pace of them were not good for that particular student, so they preferred the text and the hybrid. Again, that for me was a valuable piece of information to tell me that by giving them these alternative choices, they were able to tap into their own knowledge of how they learn and use what's best for them at that point in time. Here's another student that says, I always prefer video instruction. Then when completing the assignment, it's nice to have a text document as a companion. And then that follows up, most of the time I learn more easily from the video, but like to have the text as an organized reminder of the details of the material. So they're looking at not only when they're learning, but when they're coming back to see it. And so some of the things that I found are that the students are cognizant of their own learning strategies and what works best for them as individual learners. And it also appears that their use of learning strategies is fluid and context specific. So for me, those were really valuable things to have learned. What else did I learn? Not necessarily related to the learning, but the experience in general, is that, first off, this takes time. It takes a lot of time to do this, and you've got to be motivated to do this in order to make it happen. But the other thing that I found is that I have a much better understanding of, one, how to teach the information, and two, how the students are interacting with that. And I believe that that is making me a better teacher, which is my goal in the long run, is that I want to be a good teacher. And some of the things that I thought that I was introducing that were really strong content elements were strong content elements, but that for some people, because of their way of learning, they were actually introducing barriers to success rather than overcoming barriers to success. And so it allowed me to change the lens of how I looked at the content that I use in my classes, and was able to make a shift from how do I teach this to how are the students going to learn this. And I think that ultimately is what we're trying to do with universal design, is to find a way to give these students access. And access doesn't necessarily mean related to a physical challenge. It means a way of getting cognitive access to the content, as well as physical access to the content in a way that they can best utilize it to maximize their learning.